Everyone believed the most dangerous moment in Dominic Castelliano's life would come with a gun in his hand. They were wrong. It came with 6 quiet words spoken by the one person no one had ever noticed. The old grandfather clock echoed through the mansion's west wing, each measured chime settling over polished marble floors and towering windows that overlooked the dark shoreline of Lake Michigan. Every member of the household knew what silence meant inside the Castelliano estate. Silence meant decisions. Silence meant consequences. Silence meant no one breathed louder than necessary. Dominic stood near the fireplace, his tailored black suit untouched despite the long night, his expression carved from the same cold certainty that had made powerful people lower their voices whenever he entered a room. His right hand rested firmly around a pistol pointed toward the floor, never raised, never trembling, simply held with the calm confidence of a man who had spent years carrying responsibilities heavier than steel. Around him, security officers waited without speaking. The family attorney remained perfectly still beside an antique bookshelf. Even the head housekeeper kept her eyes lowered. No one dared interrupt whatever judgment was about to be delivered. Then came footsteps. Soft. Unhurried. Almost invisible against the thick Persian rug. No one turned at first because servants were trained to disappear into the background. They entered quietly, finished their work quietly, and left quietly. That was the rule. But Dominic looked up before anyone else did. His sharp blue eye settled on the woman standing near the doorway. Naomi Carter wore the same modest housekeeping uniform she had worn every day for nearly a year. Her dark curls were neatly gathered behind her head. A folded envelope rested gently between her fingers. She did not appear frightened. She did not appear nervous. She simply looked tired. The kind of tired that came from carrying invisible weight for far too long. For a long second neither of them spoke. Everyone else waited for Dominic to dismiss her with a single glance. Instead, he watched her as though the entire room had quietly disappeared. Naomi stepped forward until the warm light from the fireplace touched the edge of her face. She offered the smallest respectful smile, the same smile she gave every morning while setting fresh coffee outside his office before sunrise. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Castelliano," she said softly. "But I'm leaving tomorrow." Nothing else. No explanation. No complaint. No request. Just 6 simple words. The envelope slipped gently from her fingers onto the polished table beside the entrance. Dominic stared at it without moving. Then something happened that no one inside the mansion had ever witnessed before. His fingers slowly relaxed. The pistol slid from his hand and landed harmlessly on the thick rug with a dull, muffled sound that seemed impossibly loud inside the frozen room. No one moved. No one spoke. Several security guards exchanged uncertain glances. The attorney blinked in disbelief. Even the old housekeeper lifted her head, unable to hide her surprise. Dominic did not notice any of them. His attention never left Naomi. It was as if her quiet sentence had reached somewhere no threat, no negotiation, and no fortune had ever managed to touch. Questions raced through his mind with startling force. Leaving? Tomorrow? Why tomorrow? Why without telling him first? Why did the thought of her absence suddenly make the mansion feel colder than the winter wind pressing against the tall windows? Naomi lowered her eyes politely, believing she had simply delivered a resignation that would soon be forgotten like every other servant before her. She had no way of knowing that during the past 11 months she had quietly changed the rhythm of an entire household. She believed she had only cleaned rooms, folded laundry, prepared breakfast trays, and greeted people with kindness. She never realized someone had been watching the smallest things she did. She never realized that every silent act of compassion had left an invisible mark on the man now standing completely motionless before her. Outside, snow began drifting across the estate in slow white ribbons beneath the security lights. Inside, time itself seemed unwilling to move forward. And in that impossible silence. Before anyone understood why the most feared man in the city suddenly looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe, the story truly began. 11 months earlier, before anyone inside the Castellano estate had learned her name, Naomi Carter stepped off a city bus carrying a single navy blue duffel bag that held nearly everything she owned. The October wind swept across the quiet lakeside neighborhood, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and cold water as she paused outside the towering iron gates. The mansion rose behind them like something from another world, its limestone walls glowing beneath the early morning sun, its windows reflecting a life she had never imagined living so close to. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder, straightened the second-hand grey coat she had purchased from a neighborhood thrift store for $18, and whispered a silent promise to herself. She would work hard, keep her head down, and earn enough money to give her mother the peaceful life she deserved. That was the only reason she had accepted a housekeeping position nearly 900 miles away from Atlanta. It was never about luxury. It was survival. The head housekeeper, Margaret Ellis, greeted her at precisely 7 o'clock. She was a woman in her early 60s whose calm voice carried decades of quiet authority. She handed Naomi a neatly pressed uniform and smiled kindly. "There are only 3 rules here," she said as they walked through endless marble hallways filled with priceless paintings and polished wood that reflected the morning light. "Respect everyone's privacy. Never interrupt Mr. Castellano unless he speaks first. And remember that the best housekeepers are the ones no one notices." Naomi nodded without hesitation. She had spent most of her life becoming invisible whenever necessary. Growing up in a crowded apartment with a mother working double shifts as a nurse's assistant had taught her that quiet people often survive difficult seasons better than loud ones. During her first week she memorized every hallway, every staircase, every storage room, and every routine. Fresh flowers arrived every Tuesday morning. The library was dusted before sunrise. Guest suites were prepared every Thursday. Coffee was delivered outside the study at exactly 6:15 every morning without exception. Naomi never arrived late. She never complained about long hours. She simply worked with the steady patience of someone who believed dignity could exist in even the smallest task. The other employees noticed little things about her before they noticed anything else. She greeted every gardener by name after only one conversation. She thanked the security guards whenever they held a door open. She folded spare blankets for the overnight staff during unexpectedly cold evenings without anyone asking. If someone forgot lunch at home, an extra sandwich somehow appeared in the break room refrigerator with no note attached. No one could ever prove Naomi had left it there, but everyone quietly suspected she had. The mansion itself seemed different around her. The hallways felt warmer, not because the expensive heating system had changed, but because laughter occasionally drifted through rooms that had long forgotten what ordinary happiness sounded like. Margaret noticed that newer employees stopped quitting after only a few weeks. The gardeners began bringing fresh tomatoes from their home gardens to share with the kitchen staff. Even the aging golden retriever that wandered the property every afternoon started waiting near the back entrance around lunchtime because Naomi always saved part of her own meal for him before eating the rest herself. She never considered any of those moments important. They were simply the natural things to do. What Naomi did not know was that hidden security cameras quietly recorded nearly every hallway inside the estate. Dominic rarely watched them. He had more important responsibilities demanding every hour of his day. Yet on one unusually quiet Sunday evening, while reviewing maintenance footage after a burst pipe had flooded part of the basement, he happened to notice a young housekeeper kneeling beside the elderly dog, gently drying its rain-soaked fur with one of her own towels before returning to work as though nothing unusual had happened. He watched for only a few seconds before moving on to the next recording. At least he believed he had moved on. Without realizing it, he remembered her face. The first person to notice the change was not Dominic Castellano. It was the mansion itself. Houses, no matter how grand, carried the habits of the people living inside them. Before Naomi arrived, every hallway echoed with hurried footsteps, clipped conversations, and the quiet tension of people afraid to make mistakes. Breakfast trays were delivered with mechanical precision. Doors opened and closed without greeting. Employees finished their shifts and disappeared into the parking lot without looking back. It was a beautiful estate, but it felt more like a museum than a home. Naomi never tried to change any of that. She simply lived according to the values her mother had taught her long before life became difficult. Every morning, she arrived nearly 20 minutes early, not because anyone required it, but because she believed rushing created unnecessary stress. She quietly brewed fresh coffee for the kitchen staff before preparing the tray for Mr. Castellano. If one of the cooks looked exhausted, she offered to finish polishing the silverware without mentioning it again. When the maintenance supervisor struggled to carry heavy boxes of seasonal decorations down the hallway, Naomi silently held every door open until the work was finished. None of those moments were dramatic enough to become conversation, yet together they slowly reshaped the atmosphere inside the mansion. One rainy afternoon, a young dishwasher named Carlos accidentally dropped an expensive serving platter that shattered across the kitchen floor. The room instantly fell silent. Everyone knew imported porcelain like that cost more than Carlos earned in several weeks. His face turned pale as he stared at the broken pieces scattered across the tile. Before anyone could blame him, Naomi quietly knelt beside the mess, picked up the largest fragments with careful hands, and smiled gently. "Everyone drops something eventually," she said. "The important thing is making sure no one gets hurt cleaning it up." The tension disappeared almost immediately. Even Margaret Ellis noticed the difference. Instead of whispering about mistakes, employees began helping one another solve them. Instead of worrying about blame, they started sharing responsibility. Weeks passed, and the quiet transformation continued. The elderly golden retriever waiting by the back entrance gained healthy weight because Naomi never forgot his afternoon meal. The greenhouse, once neglected between landscaping visits, slowly filled with blooming flowers because she watered every plant while walking back from the laundry building. During December, when the first heavy snow covered the grounds, she secretly purchased inexpensive wool gloves for 2 security guards whose old pairs had worn thin. She left them inside their lockers without a note. They never discovered who had placed them there, but they thanked each other anyway, each believing the other had been responsible. Small acts of kindness multiplied in ways Naomi never witnessed. One employee stayed late to help another finish inventory. The pastry chef began baking extra cinnamon rolls every Friday morning for the housekeeping team. Even conversation sounded different. There was more laughter now, softer voices, and fewer anxious glances whenever footsteps echoed through the corridor. The mansion seemed to breathe a little easier. Dominic remained unaware of most of it. His days began before sunrise and often ended long after midnight inside his study, surrounded by financial reports, legal documents, and endless meetings that left little room for noticing ordinary details. Yet ordinary details have a quiet way of finding people who believe they are too busy to see them. One evening, after returning from a long business trip, Dominic entered the kitchen searching for a glass of water. The room appeared empty until he heard gentle humming near the pantry. Naomi stood on a small wooden step stool organizing shelves, carefully rotating goods so older supplies would be used first instead of wasted. She did not know he had entered. When she climbed down, she noticed a cracked ceramic mug sitting alone on the counter. Rather than throwing it away, she wrapped the handle with simple twine and placed a small wildflower inside before setting it near the kitchen window where the evening sunlight touched the glass. It was such an ordinary gesture that most people would have forgotten it within seconds. Dominic did not. He watched silently from the doorway before turning away without announcing his presence. The next morning, as sunlight filled the kitchen once again, the tiny flower remained exactly where Naomi had left it. For reasons he could not explain, Dominic found himself pausing for a brief moment before continuing toward his office, wondering why one inexpensive flower somehow made the enormous mansion feel less empty than it had in years. By the beginning of spring, Dominic Castellano had developed a habit he refused to acknowledge even to himself. Every morning before entering his study, he paused for exactly a few seconds outside the kitchen, not because he wanted another cup of coffee, but because he found himself expecting to hear the soft rhythm of Naomi Carter quietly moving through the room. She always worked with the same calm precision, never rushing, never making unnecessary noise, as though she believed peace could exist inside the smallest routines. Dominic had built his entire adult life on reading people. He recognized ambition before it was spoken. He noticed fear before it reached someone's eyes. He could usually predict what another person wanted within minutes of meeting them. Yet Naomi remained an exception that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. She never lingered near his office hoping to be noticed. She never searched for compliments. She never asked for favors, lighter assignments, or special treatment. When other employees became nervous in his presence, Naomi simply greeted him with the same respectful smile she offered the gardeners, the cooks, and the delivery drivers. It was not admiration. It was not fear. It was simple human courtesy, given equally to everyone. That difference stayed with him longer than he expected. One afternoon, heavy rain rolled across the estate, covering the gardens with silver sheets of water. Dominic stood beside the tall windows of his study while finishing a phone call. As he looked outside, his attention drifted toward the courtyard below. Naomi was crossing the stone pathway carrying a basket of freshly folded towels. Halfway across the yard she stopped, set the basket beneath the covered porch, and hurried toward a young maple tree that had bent dangerously under the weight of the storm. Instead of walking away, she carefully tied the fragile trunk to a wooden support stake using a length of garden twine she found nearby. Her uniform sleeves became soaked, and raindrops clung to her face, yet she smiled quietly after making certain the little tree stood upright again. She collected her basket and continued toward the laundry building without realizing anyone had been watching. Dominic remained by the window long after she disappeared from sight. It puzzled him that someone who owned so little could care so deeply about things that did not belong to her. A few days later, another small moment caught his attention. The estate accountant had accidentally spilled an entire folder of invoices across the library floor while rushing to prepare for an afternoon meeting. Paper scattered beneath heavy oak tables and leather chairs. Before anyone else reacted, Naomi quietly set aside the cleaning cart she was pushing and helped gather every page into perfect order. When the embarrassed accountant apologized for delaying her work, she answered with a gentle smile. Helping someone is never a delay. She returned to polishing the bookshelves as though nothing unusual had happened. Dominic overheard those words while walking past the open doorway. They lingered in his thoughts throughout the rest of the afternoon. That evening, he surprised Margaret Ellis with an unexpected question during his routine inspection of the household. "The new housekeeper," he said while reviewing maintenance reports. "Does she ever ask for anything?" Margaret looked up with mild confusion. "No, sir. In fact, I wish she would. She volunteers for extra shifts whenever another employee has a family emergency. Last month I discovered she had quietly repaired uniforms for 3 members of the housekeeping staff using her own sewing kit because she thought replacing them would cost too much." Dominic lowered the report in his hands. "Did she request reimbursement?" Margaret almost laughed. "She refused it." Silence settled between them. Outside, evening sunlight stretched across the marble hallway, filling the mansion with a warm golden glow that softened even the sharpest corners. Dominic looked toward the distant corridor where Naomi had just finished arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. She stepped back for only a moment, making certain every stem faced the sunlight before disappearing down the hall with the same quiet grace she carried every day. For reasons he still could not explain, Dominic realized he had stopped seeing her as another employee weeks ago. Without asking for attention, without telling dramatic stories about herself, and without expecting anything in return, she had accomplished something no one else inside the mansion ever had. She had made the most guarded man in the city begin paying attention not to power, not to wealth, but to kindness. Late one Friday afternoon, the mansion settled into an unusual stillness. Most of the household staff had already finished preparing for the weekend, and golden sunlight stretched across the polished marble floors like ribbons of warm glass. Naomi was quietly replacing fresh towels in the upstairs guest suites when Margaret Ellis knocked gently on the open door. "Naomi," she said with a thoughtful smile, "there is a package waiting for you in the office." Naomi looked surprised. "For me?" Margaret nodded. "It arrived by certified mail this morning." Naomi thanked her and walked downstairs carrying only a small notebook she always kept tucked inside her apron pocket. The envelope waiting on the desk was plain, with no return address except the name of a medical center in Atlanta. The moment she recognized the logo, her breathing slowed. She carefully opened the letter, unfolded several pages, and closed her eyes for a long moment before quietly smiling to herself. She whispered a soft prayer of gratitude that no one else heard. Margaret noticed tears gathering in Naomi's eyes and stepped closer with gentle concern. "Is everything all right?" Naomi nodded. "Yes. Better than all." "Right." She carefully folded the papers again. "My mother's treatment is working better than the doctors expected." Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand. "That is wonderful news." Naomi smiled again, but there was something deeper hidden behind the relief. "There is still a long road ahead," she said softly. "But now it feels like a road instead of a wall." What Margaret did not know was how much had been sacrificed to reach that moment. Years earlier, Naomi had been studying elementary education at a small college outside Atlanta. She dreamed of becoming the kind of teacher children remembered long after graduation, the one who made every student believe they mattered. During her second year, everything changed when her mother was diagnosed with a serious illness that required expensive treatment not fully covered by insurance. Naomi never hesitated. She withdrew from school before the next semester began, packed away her textbooks, accepted every job she could find, and eventually moved hundreds of miles away after hearing about an opening at the Castellano estate. She never described it as giving up her dream. She simply believed some dreams needed to wait so the people you loved could keep theirs. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Dominic remained inside his study reviewing financial reports. Margaret entered quietly with his evening tea but lingered longer than usual. Dominic noticed immediately. "Something is on your mind," he said without looking up. Margaret hesitated before answering. "I thought you should know something about Naomi." Dominic slowly raised his eyes. Margaret explained only what Naomi had willingly shared over the past several months. She spoke about the unfinished college education, the long hours, the medical bills, the extra weekend shifts Naomi accepted without complaint, and the money she faithfully sent home every month instead of spending it on herself. Dominic listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, silence settled across the room. Finally he asked one simple question. "Has she ever mentioned any of this to me?" Margaret gently shook her head. "Never. She says everyone carries burdens, and hers are not anyone else's responsibility." After Margaret left, Dominic remained seated long after the reports on his desk lost their importance. Through the window he could see Naomi crossing the courtyard beneath the soft evening sky, carrying 2 grocery bags toward the employee residence. One bag held her own modest dinner. The other contained fresh fruit, soup, and medicine she had quietly purchased for an elderly groundskeeper recovering from surgery. She never stopped to think about who might notice. She simply kept walking with the same quiet purpose she carried every day. Dominic realized something uncomfortable in that moment. Nearly everyone who entered his world wanted something from him. Influence. Opportunity. Protection. Approval. Naomi was different. She had stood within his household for almost a year while asking for absolutely nothing except the chance to earn an honest paycheck. For the first time in many years, Dominic found himself wondering whether true strength had ever belonged to the people with the most power, or whether it had quietly belonged all along to a woman who had sacrificed her own future without expecting the world to applaud her for it. Summer arrived quietly along the shores of Lake Michigan, and with it came longer mornings filled with golden sunlight spilling across the limestone walls of the Castellano estate. The mansion still followed its precise routines, but something invisible had shifted over the passing months. Employees no longer counted the hours until their shifts ended. Conversations lingered a little longer in the kitchen. Fresh flowers appeared in unexpected corners of the house. Even visitors occasionally commented that the estate felt surprisingly welcoming despite its imposing architecture. No one could explain exactly why. Naomi never claimed responsibility because she never believed she had changed anything at all. She simply continued living one ordinary day after another. Dominic noticed something different as well, although it took him longer to understand what it was. For years, his mornings had begun with unanswered emails, untouched breakfasts, and endless cups of coffee that usually went cold before he finished half of them. Recently, however, he found himself sitting down for breakfast almost every day. The meals had not become more extravagant. In fact, they were often remarkably simple. Fresh fruit, warm toast, oatmeal prepared exactly the way he preferred without ever having explained his preference to anyone, and coffee served at precisely the right temperature. It puzzled him how someone could observe details so carefully without making those observations feel intrusive. One morning, while reading financial reports at the dining table, Dominic realized he had finished an entire breakfast without once looking at his phone. That had not happened in years. Across the room, Naomi quietly adjusted the curtains to allow more morning sunlight into the dining room before preparing to leave. As always, she intended to disappear before he acknowledged her presence. "Miss Carter," Dominic said calmly. She turned immediately. "Yes, Mr. Castellano?" He looked at the breakfast in front of him for a brief moment before meeting her eyes. "The coffee is excellent." Naomi smiled with genuine warmth. "I am glad you enjoyed it, sir." That was the entire conversation. She returned to her work without expecting anything more, while Dominic found himself unexpectedly thinking about how rare genuine gratitude had become in his own life. Days turned into weeks. On several occasions Dominic observed Naomi stopping to speak with the elderly groundskeeper during lunch, making certain he remembered to take his medication before returning to work. She quietly reminded the youngest kitchen assistant about his evening community college classes whenever he seemed discouraged. When one of the security guards became a first-time father, Naomi organized a small congratulatory basket filled with baby blankets, storybooks, and handwritten notes collected from nearly every employee in the mansion. She never placed her own name on the card. Everyone assumed Margaret had organized it until Margaret herself quietly admitted she had not. Dominic listened as staff members laughed together over lunch one afternoon, something he had almost never heard inside those walls before Naomi arrived. The sound lingered in the air long after he walked away. Later that evening he stood alone inside the library, surrounded by shelves of expensive first editions collected over decades. The room had always been his refuge, yet it no longer felt as silent as it once had. Through the open doorway he watched Naomi carefully return a children's storybook to its proper shelf after discovering it had been left behind by the daughter of one of his business guests. Instead of simply placing it back, she gently smoothed the bent corner of a page before closing the cover with the same care someone might show a treasured family photograph. Dominic wondered how many acts of kindness she performed each day without believing anyone would ever notice. The answer unsettled him because he had begun noticing all of them. That realization slowly changed something inside him. His meetings became shorter because he no longer saw endless work as the only measure of success. He started taking evening walks through the gardens instead of remaining inside his office until midnight. He even asked Margaret one afternoon whether the staff dining room needed renovations after realizing many employees spent more time there than in their own homes. Margaret smiled quietly, recognizing a question she never expected to hear. Naomi remained completely unaware of the quiet transformation taking place. She believed the mansion had simply become a happier place because good people were choosing to care for one another. She never imagined that the man everyone described as unshakable had slowly begun measuring each day not by contracts signed or meetings completed, but by whether he happened to cross paths with a housekeeper whose greatest strength was making ordinary moments feel like they mattered. Autumn arrived almost unnoticed, painting the maple trees surrounding the estate with shades of amber and crimson that glowed beneath the afternoon sun. Nearly a full year had passed since Naomi Carter first walked through the iron gates carrying nothing more than a single duffel bag and quiet determination. To everyone around her, she seemed exactly the same. She still greeted every employee with the same gentle smile. She still paused to water the flowers nearest the greenhouse before beginning her morning duties. She still made certain the elderly groundskeeper had enough soup waiting for lunch whenever the weather turned cold. Yet inside her room, tucked neatly inside the top drawer of a small wooden dresser, rested an envelope that changed everything. It had arrived 3 days earlier from an elementary school district outside Atlanta. Naomi had stared at the letter for nearly 10 minutes before opening it, almost afraid hope would disappear if she unfolded the paper too quickly. The position she had applied for months ago, never expecting a reply, had finally become available. The district had also partnered with a scholarship program willing to help her complete the final year of her education while she worked. Her mother had recovered enough to return home from rehabilitation, and for the first time in years, the future no longer looked like a series of impossible choices. It looked like a beginning. Naomi sat quietly beside the small window in her room that evening, holding the acceptance letter against her chest as tears slowly filled her eyes. They were not tears of sadness. They were the quiet release that comes after carrying responsibility for far longer than anyone should. She whispered a prayer of gratitude before carefully placing the letter back inside its envelope. Then she made the hardest decision she had faced in months. She would leave the estate. Not because she wanted to escape it, but because staying would mean abandoning the dream she had promised herself she would one day finish. The next morning she began preparing in silence. She purchased a modest bus ticket scheduled for the following afternoon. She folded every uniform with the same care she had shown while wearing it. She packed her few belongings into the same navy blue duffel bag she had carried almost a year earlier. There was no celebration, no announcement, and no dramatic farewell. Naomi believed good people should leave a place as gently as they entered it. Margaret Ellis noticed the neatly folded uniforms resting on Naomi's bed while stopping by to deliver fresh linens. She immediately understood what they meant. "You accepted the position, did you not?" she asked softly. Naomi smiled with both excitement and sadness. "Yes. I finally did." Margaret embraced her without saying another word. After a long moment she stepped back and quietly asked, "Have you told Mr. Castellano?" Naomi lowered her eyes. "Not yet. He has important meetings all week. I do not want to interrupt them. I will hand him my resignation tomorrow morning." Margaret looked at her with gentle concern. "I think your absence may be noticed more than you realize." Naomi offered a small laugh. "I clean rooms, Margaret. Someone else will learn where everything belongs. Life always moves forward." But life inside the mansion had already begun revealing small signs that her departure would leave behind spaces no schedule could easily fill. The elderly golden retriever waited by the back entrance that afternoon, wagging his tail patiently, unaware that the familiar hand offering him part of every lunch would soon be gone. The young kitchen assistant excitedly told Naomi he had earned the highest grades of his semester because she never allowed him to give up on evening classes. She congratulated him warmly but never mentioned that she would not be there to hear about his next achievement. Even the fresh flowers in the dining room seemed brighter after she carefully arranged them one last time. Dominic remained completely unaware of the quiet countdown unfolding around him. His calendar overflowed with meetings, phone calls, and documents requiring immediate attention. Yet without understanding why, he found himself noticing strange little absences throughout the day. The small wildflower by the kitchen window had begun to fade. The library somehow felt quieter than usual. The morning coffee tasted exactly the same, yet he caught himself looking toward the doorway, expecting to see Naomi adjusting the curtains before disappearing into another hallway. She never appeared because she had spent that morning boxing the final pieces of a life she had never imagined she would miss. By sunset, her packed duffel bag rested beside the door of her room, ready for the journey home. Only one task remained before she could leave behind nearly a year of quiet service. She needed to place a single envelope into the hands of the one man who still had no idea that tomorrow, the heartbeat of his home would quietly walk away. Morning arrived beneath a pale grey sky, and the Castellano estate awakened with the familiar rhythm that had repeated itself for years. Fresh coffee filled the kitchen with its rich aroma. Gardeners trimmed the hedges before the first guests could arrive. Housekeepers polished marble floors until they reflected the soft light pouring through the towering windows. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Only Naomi Carter knew she would witness these routines for the very last time. She rose before dawn, carefully made the small bed that had been her home for nearly a year, folded the final blanket with slow, deliberate hands, and lifted the navy blue duffel bag waiting beside the dresser. Before leaving her room, she paused for a single quiet moment. She looked around at the modest space that had sheltered her through one of the hardest chapters of her life and smiled with grateful eyes. Then she quietly closed the door behind her. Downstairs, Dominic Castellano's morning had begun very differently. An urgent disagreement between several senior advisors had filled the West Wing with anxious voices before sunrise. Documents covered the long conference table inside the library, while security personnel moved quickly through the corridors carrying folders and answering phone calls in lowered voices. Dominic stood near the fireplace listening patiently, one hand resting around the familiar weight he often carried during moments requiring complete authority. His expression remained calm, but everyone around him could feel the tension hanging over the room like an approaching storm. No one dared interrupt the discussion. Margaret Ellis noticed Naomi standing quietly outside the open doorway, the resignation envelope resting gently between her hands. Their eyes met for only a second. Margaret gave the smallest encouraging nod. Naomi inhaled slowly, straightened her shoulders, and stepped forward with the same quiet confidence she had carried since her first day inside the mansion. The conversations around the room gradually faded as people noticed the young housekeeper approaching. Most assumed she had arrived to collect empty coffee cups or straighten the library before the next meeting. Dominic remained focused on the discussion until he sensed someone waiting respectfully nearby. He turned. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows, catching the dust floating gently through the air while the crackling fireplace filled the silence with soft warmth. Naomi offered the same gentle smile that had greeted him nearly every morning for 11 months. There was no fear in her eyes. No expectation. Only quiet gratitude. "I am sorry to interrupt, Mr. Castellano," she said softly. Her voice remained steady despite the emotion quietly resting beneath every word. She placed the sealed envelope on the polished walnut table beside him. "But I am leaving tomorrow." Silence answered her. It was not an ordinary silence. It was the kind that seemed to pull every sound from the room. Dominic stared first at the envelope, then back into Naomi's eyes as though he had misunderstood what she had said. "Leaving? Tomorrow?" The words refused to settle inside his mind. They felt impossible, almost unreal. Around him, advisors exchanged uncertain glances. Security officers remained perfectly still. Margaret lowered her eyes, already knowing what would happen next, although even she could not have imagined its weight. Dominic's fingers slowly relaxed. Without realizing it, he released the object he had been holding. It slipped from his hand onto the thick Persian rug with a soft, harmless thud that echoed across the silent room far louder than anyone expected. Every face turned toward him in disbelief. No one inside the estate had ever seen Dominic Castellano lose focus, even for a heartbeat. Yet he did not notice the stunned expression surrounding him. His entire attention remained fixed on Naomi. Questions crowded his thoughts faster than he could answer them. Why had she never mentioned another opportunity? Why had she planned to leave without asking? For anything? Why did the simple idea of this quiet woman walking out of the front gate suddenly make the enormous mansion feel unbearably empty? Naomi misunderstood his silence. Believing she had interrupted an important meeting, she lowered her head respectfully. "Thank you for allowing me to work here," she said with quiet sincerity. "Your kindness gave my family a second chance. I will always be grateful." She gently stepped backward, preparing to leave the room exactly as quietly as she had entered it. Dominic finally found his voice, but it emerged softer than anyone had ever heard before. "Naomi." She stopped immediately and turned back toward him. The entire mansion seemed to pause with her. For the first time in many years, Dominic Castellano understood that there were moments in life no amount of influence, success, or wealth could ever control. Some people entered your world without asking permission, changed it without realizing they had done so, and left behind a silence that no one else could ever fill. Naomi turned back slowly, surprised by the softness in Dominic Castellano's voice. During the 11 months she had worked inside the mansion, she had heard him speak with confidence, authority, and quiet certainty, but never with hesitation. The room remained perfectly still as every pair of eyes shifted between them. Dominic looked at the envelope resting on the polished table before lifting it with deliberate care. Inside was a neatly typed letter expressing gratitude for the opportunity to work at the estate, thanking every member of the household for their kindness, and explaining that she had accepted a teaching position near her recovering mother in Georgia. There were no complaints, no requests, and no mention of the sacrifices she had made. Only gratitude. Dominic finished reading the final sentence and quietly folded the letter. For several long moments, he simply stood there, looking at the woman who had transformed an entire household without ever asking for recognition. "You are leaving because your dream is waiting for you," he said at last. Naomi nodded gently. "Yes, sir. My mother is healthy enough to live on her own again, and I finally have the chance to finish what I started." Dominic slowly smiled, although it was touched with unmistakable sadness. Then no one should stand in the way of that. Several advisors looked at him in confusion. They had expected him to negotiate, persuade, or insist that she remain. Instead, he walked around the table until he stood only a few feet away from Naomi. "Would you allow me one request before you go?" he asked. Naomi looked genuinely surprised. "Of course, sir. Please let me drive you to the station tomorrow." The room fell silent once again. Margaret lowered her head, hiding a grateful smile. Naomi hesitated for only a moment before answering. "I would be honored." The following morning dawned bright and clear. Autumn sunlight painted the trees in brilliant shades of gold as Dominic personally loaded Naomi's single navy blue duffel bag into the trunk of a dark sedan. There was no convoy of vehicles, no formal ceremony, and no speeches. Only two people sharing a quiet drive through streets that seemed strangely peaceful. They spoke about simple things during the trip. Naomi described the small elementary school where she hoped to teach. Dominic admitted that he had never realized how much a single person's kindness could influence hundreds of ordinary moments. When they arrived at the station, Naomi reached for her bag, but Dominic handed her a small leather folder instead. She looked at him with quiet confusion. "What is this?" she asked. "Please open it after you are seated," he replied. Naomi thanked him warmly before stepping onto the platform. As the bus prepared to depart, she found her seat beside the window and carefully opened the folder. Inside was a letter written in Dominic's own handwriting. Beneath it rested documents establishing a scholarship fund that would cover the remainder of her college tuition, classroom supplies for her first year of teaching, and a modest home purchased in her mother's name only a few miles from the school district where Naomi would begin her new career. At the bottom of the letter were simple words that brought tears quietly to her eyes. "You spent nearly a year reminding everyone inside my home that dignity is found in ordinary acts of kindness. This is not payment. Kindness cannot be purchased. It is only one grateful man making certain the future you sacrificed for others is finally waiting where it belongs. Thank you for helping me remember the person I hoped I could still become." Naomi gently folded the letter against her heart as the bus slowly pulled away from the station. Outside, Dominic remained standing on the sidewalk long after the vehicle disappeared beyond the intersection. When he returned to the estate later that afternoon, the mansion felt quieter than it had in many months, yet something inside it had permanently changed. Employees greeted one another with warmer smiles. Fresh flowers still appeared in the dining room each morning because someone had continued Naomi's tradition. The elderly golden retriever still waited patiently by the back entrance because several members of the staff now shared their lunches with him. Kindness had become part of the house itself. Dominic walked into the kitchen and noticed the small ceramic mug Naomi had repaired months earlier still resting beside the window with a single fresh wildflower inside. He smiled, not because she had stayed, but because she had left behind something far greater than her presence. She had left behind a different way of seeing people. And on that quiet autumn morning, everyone who had known Naomi Carter remembered that true strength is never measured by power, wealth, or fear. It is measured by the gentle courage to leave every place, and every person, better than you found them.